you this morning. Sorry, I'm stuck. My head's still stuck in this conference I've been involved in, and I sent you a War and Peace this morning. so I do apologise.
We're now streaming live. Hello, I'm John from Broadsheet, and you're very welcome. This is the 12th in a series of shows looking at the Mother and Baby Home Commission of Investigation report. We're joined once again by Tuam campaigner Breeda Murphy, adoptee and activist Eunan Duffy, and we're also joined, very honoured to be joined once again by Frank Brehany. Hello, Frank.
Hi there. Frank
is a second generation Tuam adoptee, once removed. Frank's father was adopted out of Tuam, and sadly his mother spent 42 years then in institutions. You're very welcome again, Frank, and very welcome to everybody. Breeda, I just want to go to you because story by Ken Fox last weekend in the Sunday Independent, I believe, concerning county councils and their apologies to regarding the mother and baby homes. I'll just get the story up here. Perhaps you could explain that story a bit better than I could, Breeda.
On Sunday, the county council, what appeared on the paper was that the council, Ken Fox had uncovered through FOI a document which suggested that the councils were advised that they did not need to give an apology. They could adopt the apology provided by the Taoiseach or the minister. And I wondered about that because there was a certain resistance within some councils to engage. And it kind of fell into place and made sense then if indeed they were given directives from both Housing and Local Government Minister Darragh O'Brien and from the Minister for Children, Roderick O'Gorman, to merely follow by their lead, knowing what we know about councils and how the power was held and invested locally, and how, for instance, Galway County Council, when a lady had her second child, that she would then enter the Magdalene Institution. And as the Reverend Mother said in the Magdalene Institution, when asked how long they would stay, she said some stay for life. So effectively it was a life sentence. So we had made application some years ago to Galway County Council, which was warmly received, and about 25 of us or so went to the council and gave a presentation. We followed on from there to go to Mayo County Council. Mayo County Council at that time declined the offer, it appeared, but sometime later, well, only recently, they held their own meeting. And it was a special meeting put forward by a local councillor who was born in Tuam and who did remember Christy Hyland, who is now in Westport. So he put forward a motion to hold a special meeting to discuss. Now, one of the things that was quite clear was that when there wasn't a mother and baby home within the county council jurisdiction area, and when the women were then sent to other institutions outside the county, it appeared that there wasn't a need to address that at all. So it seemed as though for Mayo, for Tipperary, for instance, maybe Kildare, that they did not have any need to apologise. And that's why when we saw the article carried on the Daily Mail, carried on the Irish Independent on Sunday, it suggested that they'd actually received instruction to appoint to enable them to shirk their responsibility. So, of course, I questioned that, wrote to the ministers, both ministers on Sunday, and wrote to, there's a group of 31 councillors who gathered together, who formulate ideas on policy, and, you know, so that they're all singing from the one hymn sheet, effectively. And there's a county councillor from Cork, Mr. Lucy, who is their chair. So I wrote to him to ask how they did not invite people who were directly affected, the survivors, the families, and those to present to council so that they would witness firsthand. So the reply was that they didn't. They replied today And the reply was along the lines that they actually do not instruct. They didn't instruct. But I mean, what else do you call it when you give direction? You know, and while the councils themselves, they said they did it on foot of the councils asking them for what they would say to the press. They'd never thought that people who were affected by this, like, you know, a second generation, third generation, like Frank, for instance, would come to them. And they are the people with the knowledge and with the power. So then yesterday, I lobbied, one of the councils I'd also lobbied was Offaly. And yesterday, Offaly County Council held their meeting. And I spoke to the Cathaoirleach in the morning, Mr. Carroll. And he was quite abrupt, you know, because I'd written to all 19 councillors, 18 of whom are male. There is one female on the council. And she had put forward a motion, Claire Claffey. And I just wanted to talk to the Cathaoirleach to see if they would hold a special meeting. Basically, that's what I was asking him in the morning. But he told me he was busy and he didn't engage, nor did any of the 18 men on the council for Offaly. And considering that one of their constituents is a lovely lady called Mary Lawler, born in 1960 in Shanross Abbey. Her mother rooted to Shanross Abbey from Offaly. She was then rooted back as a small child and adopted by a lady who was then 45 years of age. And the council shirked their responsibility. She will tell you that story herself because I've talked to her about it and I would prefer she related it. But 5 years later, her mother was back in the institution and gave birth to a little boy who she found out just a few years ago was trafficked to the United States. So the council were completely responsible for that. And there's another wonderful advocate called William Gorey whose family were taken into care by the cruelty man. It was in the 1970s, and some members of his family were disabled, and he was watching out for his brothers. One of his brothers died while in state care, which he feels traumatized about. And William should also address or be invited to address the council, because until the councillors themselves hear those stories, and I've looked at the images of the council, you know, the councillors are all on their webpage, and many of them are elderly. And listen, I'm elderly myself, so it's not anything so negative. What it is that we can teach and we can learn. You can be 90 years of age and learn something new. And I think the lost opportunity was that we were not invited, or those most affected and living within that jurisdiction were not invited to contribute and have a debate. Nobody spoke. What happened was the motion was read in the apology was read into the record, and then the council continued with its business. And that, to me, considering there were 19 people.
And was the apology the template that Neil Martin suggests, or that had been suggested?
Yes.
Right.
Similar, and I'll give it to you. It's actually on the Offaly Independent. We can access it there. But considering that I'd written at length to each of the councillors, and it's kind of unusual not to get any reply from I did get a reply from Councillor Claffey, who placed a motion forward.
She's a soft Dem.
She's soft Dems.
Okay.
And the only female. So she has tried and will continue, I'm sure, to raise the point. But for the others, many of them, you know, would have lived and have knowledge of the period the same way that I have some knowledge and I have some understanding of what the women and the children went through. I mean,
how many councils have apologised to date?
John, I don't know. I know that the ones who need to, again, are Donegal and Monaghan and Louth, because they were the border counties. But they need to look at their records. But I would state that every council should hold a special meeting. And what I've done with the Commission's report is that I've picked out areas of relevance to that council and written to them on that, together with written about, you know, survivors from their area that is in records. So yeah, it's just a missed opportunity again, and it's the fact that while I said to those who represent county councils that once again you are actually taking the voice or suppressing the voice of the survivor, you know.
Yeah. Speaking of which, Frank, in terms of this gagging order on an industrial school survivor was issued a gagging order in terms of his compensation, but he couldn't divulge how much compensation he'd received. What were your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm used to, when we talk about gagging orders, we're talking about non-disclosure agreements. And they tend to be deployed in commercial disputes or, say, employment problems, and, you know, where settlements are made and people go away. And it's designed to try and keep what is relatively a small-scale problem under control. It's about PR management. It's about crisis management. And I actually don't see the logic that's at play here in relation to the deployments of non-disclosure agreements. I mean, I can see the article on screen that you've got up at the moment, and I really couldn't understand not just the logic, but the legal rationale behind this, because ultimately, you know, whether you're talking about industrial schools, Magdalen laundries, mother and baby homes, they are common social scandals. They are not commercial disputes or employment disputes. And therefore, any kind of resolution that is calculated, whether you agree with that resolution or not, but any kind of resolution that is calculated shouldn't bear the hallmarks of a non-disclosure agreement or a gagging order, because quite honestly, the resolutions that I've seen to date involve issues of great public interest. And the one thing that you don't do where there are matters of great public interest is to basically snuff out any kind of opportunity for the individuals who've been affected to actually talk either privately or publicly about the issues that have affected them. And so, as I say, it is a rather strange approach to this. And I can imagine, the more I thought about this, I can imagine that there are many victims and survivors out there, you know, through the industrial schools, maybe the Magdalen laundries, and goodness me, I certainly hope it isn't deployed in the mother and baby homes redress scheme if that gets off the ground, because if you are as a government trying to deploy the process of a restorative justice or a restorative scheme, you cannot have a restorative scheme that is not publicly viewable, that it is not transparent, and that it somehow limits the opportunity of the victims and survivors to state their case, to educate, which is the very point that actually the Breeda has just made about the ability to put forward the message. You're never too old to learn, is what Breeda said. And that is correct. And because if you have then a category of people who've been affected by these awful incidents, who then can't go on to speak about their experiences, to educate, then that is not restorative.
Oh.
If you have a group of people who are subject to an non-disclosure agreement, who then, for whatever reason, can't, I've seen this in other NDAs, where clients have, in fact, I've actually experienced this in practice myself, where clients have come to me to say, well, I want advice, but the problem is I can't give you an advice. I can't give you the information because the advice I've been given is that I've signed this non-disclosure agreement, and therefore I can't share important detail that you can give me legal advice on. I have even seen in a barrister's advice in one case I was dealing with, very difficult case, not related to this subject matter, where the first 60 pages of a 200-page advice was a non-disclosure agreement, which in that case, the client refused to comply with. She refused to accept that non-disclosure agreement. And so therefore, you're creating a very unhappy set of circumstances, which flies in the face of any kind of idea of restorative justice. And hey, John, you know, it was only a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about the issue of truth and reconciliation. And the issues behind that. And truth and reconciliation is about restorative justice as much as it is about retributive justice. And often there's a combination of the two. But the one unifying factor in all of this is you do not stymie, you do not gag the people who've been affected by these terrible incidents.
Yeah, Eunan, sorry,
no, that's
Eunan,
fine.
They obviously don't want, they want to set off, they don't want to show other victims how much this guy's getting. I mean, they want to keep it, the figures as low as possible, I guess. Is that your thinking, Eunan, in terms of gagging orders and for compensation?
Yeah, absolutely, because it's one thing trying to mitigate the public knowing what kind of financial redress and monies are awarded to these people, but it's of course trying to mitigate these people taking any further civil litigation and opening the floodgates for other people to do so. We're finding that the historical institutional abuse inquiry that's the redress scheme is ongoing here since the 31st of March last year. It's exactly the same thing, because I have a number of peers and contacts that have been told in recent months that they have to choose between any civil litigation case that's ongoing and what might be coming of that redress scheme. So, you know, it's a widespread systemic strategy at the end of the day that's used here. And of course, what it means is that there's highly likely to be any criminal prosecutions. The religious orders will always do their very best to try and push people down through the civil courts, because that sort of compounds the misery, it indemnifies the secrecy, etc., and it just makes the whole thing that more sordid, and it means that the public don't know what's going out in public and what these religious orders have done, because there's obviously a catalogue of historical offences being carried out here by individuals on the institutions themselves. So the best way is to get these guys at their own expense pushed through civil courts, and then before they go into the court, the vast majority of them are settled out of court, and with an NDA, gagging order, whatever the case may be, to make sure that they don't go public.
And for instance, if a survivor contacts you, in terms of, are you, Breeda, in terms of the mother baby home report, what do you say to them regarding redress? That it's on its way, or that? I mean, what do you say to them, Breeda?
Oak Consulting have been employed by the government to meet with survivors, and we're to meet them as a group. Some of our people will meet with them on a Zoom call to discuss what redress might amount to for them. But the strong part is that, of course, we need to have a written submission that we can then reveal, because when you look at how governments work, they lull us into a false sense of security, like they did with people for the Commission's confidential report. And so people went in and gave their evidence and didn't receive a copy of that evidence. So anything we do, we need to have in writing, and we need to show clearly what redress should include. As Frank says, you know, the gagging order first thing has to, you know, that has no place in that. But survivors, redress is it can be complicated, can be many things, but ultimately redress is accountability.
Yes.
It is also transparency. It is also the opportunity for those who have been so impacted upon throughout their lives and their families witnessing that impact and experiencing that impact into the next generation. There should be the opportunity for them where it's possible to take a case, and they should be supported in that. And with regard to the children who are lost from the mother and baby homes, and those who have not received information, families and that, again, there has to be the opportunity to hold those in power to account, because many of those who were involved, while many may be deceased, the reality is the system is still protecting itself.
Of course.
The system is very much there when you look at councils and when you look at the behaviour of government, and the appointment of Oak Consulting. And I have spoken to Mary Lou Kennedy, who is she comes up as her area being conflict resolution, which is really interesting. And I said, why would we come into this in conflict? Why, she said, no, the other skills she brings on board. But ultimately, I said to her, this is a can-kicking exercise, and one which you're invested in by signing up to it. And if we don't sign up, then we are out in the cold. But by that same token, we realise that we can have a copy of a submission that we can make public. And this is a very clear demand, not a request, because survivors have waited too long for justice. And the appointment of Oak Consulting is quite unclear. We haven't seen the briefing paper. We don't know how much they are getting. We don't know the duration. The terms of the contract and everything else.
So just in the immediate, if a survivor came to either yourself or Eunan and is elderly and could use financial help, could use some sort of redress now, is there a mechanism by which they can get that? And how? There's nothing until they set up the redress scheme properly.
There's never been anything, John. And one of the things I was hoping for, and we put forward before, was that they are very clearly survivors. They've survived an institution where many, many children died. And that's largely down to luck, but it's also down to their skills of coping in the interim to live this long. So they are entitled to redress, and redress now, because some of our survivors are quite elderly and quite ill. So we've suggested, Eunan and I have spoken of this before, and we've suggested an interim payment should be paid immediately, so that at least they would have the written apology from government, which should be addressed to them, which should also name their mother by name and acknowledge, that they've done wrong by her. But, the governments hold all the cards in this, and the appointment of Oak Consulting is really out of the blue. I mean, why do they need somebody to intercede for us when we're quite well able to tell the government, and we've told them many times, what we need?
Yeah. So, Eunan, you say the same to survivors, then there's nothing we can do until this redress training scheme is set up. And in the interim, they've set up this, they've outsourced the survivors' kind of process.
Absolutely, John. Look, it's all designed to falsely put people on a pedestal and make people think as if they're being consulted and participant in these things. Everything's preordained. They know exactly where they're going. They know what the limitations are going to be. So, obviously we have an investigative process going on in the north, for example, with these co-designers, and we have absolutely no access to government while this co-design process is set up. We've been closed off from government facilitation altogether. The panel facilitators that have been employed are basically our voices now, and they take our voices, shall I say, and recommendations to an interdepartmental working group, who then takes it to government. And in the meantime, we have requested the fact that there needs to be a concurrent interim payment scheme in terms of the monies that needs to be set up right away, and not only an interim payment scheme with a standard basic payment of say £10,000 or whatever the recommendation would be, but in the meantime that all of the social and medical and health provisions would be looked after in the meantime as well, because that's hugely important. You know, while this 6-month process takes place, like every sort of a scheme and mechanism there's been in the south of Ireland as well, review after review, process after process, the whole preordained strategy here is to drag every single process out as long as they possibly can, which obviously and naturally affects the victim and survivor, their relatives, and the fact that they're going to expire in terms of a premature death, for example, in many cases because of their health conditions, which are obviously common and originating from their time in an institution. But also any prospect there might be for criminal prosecutions dies off by the day as well in terms of the perpetrators.
Of course. Frank, you were talking about how you hadn't experienced an NDA in terms of the outside of a kind of commercial commercial world, and equally this is Oak Consulting. I gather they conflict dynamics is their thing. It's kind of an insult, really.
Well, it may well be. It's part of their branding. With mediation companies, they have all sorts of descriptives about what they are. But I'll tell you what it does remind me of. It reminds me within the European Union, because I've done a lot of work in Brussels and Strasbourg and so on. And I've been party to consultations on the things that I've been involved in. And one of the devices that's used quite extensively across the European Union is to carry out what they call impact assessments. And in carrying out impact assessments, they sometimes use conflict resolution managers, or they use business consultancies. And these are designed to try and help, for example, in this case, the European Commission to determine the direction of travel as far as policy or law is concerned. There is an argument, I think, where you've got a multinational kind of body like the European Union, I think there is a great deal of sense in adopting that kind of approach. But I think where you're dealing with essentially a very acute national scandal, because there's no other word for it, it does raise the question, and it comes back to Breeda's point about Offaly Council and indeed central government, is why do you have to have this layer of consultative process? It's not beyond the wit of the children's department, the children's minister, to carve out a niche within his own department that is wholly focused on talking to the victims and survivors groups throughout the Republic. And I think that, you know, I think at the moment, without the transparency of seeing what their remit is, it's difficult, I think, for people who are not familiar with this kind of impact assessments, if that's what it's called, or just simple inquiry. It's difficult for most people who are not familiar with that setup to understand what the issue is. But I think on a national level, I'm not sure if it's appropriate. I can't say in the UK that I'm aware of a similar scheme being put into place. So it is it's strange. Yes, it is strange. Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
Sorry, I was just wanting to pick up on a point there that was made by Eunan and lastly Breeda, and I think it's a very important point. And it's this issue about any redress scheme or compensation, and it's to do with NDAs as well. You know, if you are, as a country, setting up a restorative compensation scheme, it should be completely transparent because it's a huge public interest matter. And the tariffs, or the calculation of tariffs, because if that's how it's set out or calculated, they should be publicly available. Now, I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate here, because the one thing that struck me about all of this, there are many victims and survivors who would allege crimes have been committed against them. Yeah. And there is already a compensation scheme in all European countries. And believe it or not, I still class the UK as a European country. But within all European countries, there is a criminal injuries compensation scheme. Now that scheme, I'm raising this as an analogy, not to make a point about the crime, but a criminal injuries compensation scheme is set up, and it's guided by European Union principles now, set up because it's a public interest that victims of crime should be compensated. And those schemes throughout all European countries, whether it's Spain, France, UK, Ireland, whomever, they have to have a demonstrably transparent tariff sort of set out scheme, which any member of the public can go online and see what that's about. Now, that's about restorative justice, Minister. And, you know, if you can have a scheme to deal with criminal injuries, and just remember my point about how many victims and survivors see their situation, then I think in any restorative justice scheme to deal with industrial schools, Magdalene homes, laundries, and mother and baby homes, that needs to be set out loud and clear. What constitutes that scheme? What are the tariffs? How is it calculated? Instead of breeding potentially, I'm not saying it does happen, but potentially that Miss A is not happy with Miss B because Miss B got more than Miss A. Yeah.
Well, this is it. I mean, and in terms of old consulting, I'm not having a go at the company.
In particular with, that's all right. You see this in particular with the criminal injuries scheme and the way it's operated. There are subtleties that determine why a person will get more compensation with a similar type case. And until the Irish government wakes up to this fact that it needs to demonstrate to all Irish citizens, whether you've been affected or not, that this is the scheme that we're putting in place. It's a restorative element to this terrible story, and we want to be completely transparent about it and get rid of the potential to breed even more anger and suspicion amongst the victims and survivors.
To be generous, Eunan and Breeda as well, just on this, taking it outsourcing it, is that O'Gorman kind of saying, look, it's impossible to do this in-house almost because, well, you saw what happened with this report. Is he in effect saying that, you know, much like we were saying a couple of weeks ago, or am I being too charitable towards him, perhaps? I mean, why bring in this consultancy company?
Well, like Frank says, you know, the government have all the resources. They could
if they're paying for Oak Consulting, they're working for the government rather than they're not.
They're working for the government, but it's also another layer that when it goes belly up or something happens, that the government can say, you know, hands off. We did it in good faith, and we're not rightly to blame. It's a delaying tactic. It was unforeseen from my perspective. I didn't know that they were going to employ anybody. I thought Redress. But there again, you know, 6 years ago, I thought when you have a site where there are 796 children, that the law would fall into place and that the site would be protected and the remains of those children unearthed. At this point, I have said in the last few weeks that we are further away from just You know, at this point, it just appears to be making the same mistakes again and again and again, and the many reports with no resolution. I do thank the most recent Marion Reynolds, who produced the report on adoption, because at least she would not allow her name to go with it in the event that anything was redacted. But, you know, governments hold all the cards, John. It's just another layer. It's another kicking the can. More survivors will pass away, more will become too elderly or too infirm, or dementia will hit, and they will not be able to recall.
Eunan, is there any, will you be seeking retroactive compensation for, I mean, there was a lady who died in January, wasn't it? Breeda in Galway.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It should, and Frank is probably the one to speak on this, really, because we have had our own discussions, and, you know, we will do a lengthy submission. And I think Frank is the most skilled in the area of the legal putting together how this should, from a human rights perspective.
What about the emergency payment thing aspect? I mean, it's something that really would be great to, like Eunan said, just as a some kind of gesture, interim gesture.
Well, if I could just throw in an example there, the HIA inquiry that we had and delivered in January 2017 started in 2012 into historical institutional abuse. That judge, Sir Anthony Hart, one of his recommendations was that any relative coming forward to claim financial redress on behalf of a victim survivor that had died in regard to one of the institutions, he made a recommendation of 75% of what that entitlement would have been for that person if they had still been alive. So there was a redress panel of experts set up to counteract a lot of his recommendations, and they just found absolutely no reason why, who comes up with these figures, 75% of a full entitlement, you know, for relatives. So they obviously recommended that should be, 100% while that person was living or dead. So, you know, this is what we're trying to say to government all the time, you know, that the government are the masters of illusion. I mean, when it comes to smoke and mirrors, these guys have no predecessors, they have absolutely boundless energy and focus on creating all sorts of schemes and measures. And O'Gorman's done exactly the same with this restorative recognition scheme and outsourcing it. It's to make it look like, you know, we're doing our very best for you guys here, you know, to create some form of, whether it's token independence or not, you know what I mean, and creating these, the judiciary and former judiciary to carry out these inquiries and commissions. You know what I mean? That's why we're well past this now, and we're saying, you know, we need to be looking far outside of the dominions within which we're operating. We need to be going international and getting human rights commissioners involved in every aspect of any kind of investigation that happens here, because, you know, we have lost all faith and trust on trying to get that back. I never had it in the first place. Some other people might have it and you might get it back for them, but the vast majority of people need basically action on the ground, and there's only one way that's going to happen. You know what I mean? So even you could even question, we don't know yet how much money this consultancy firm is even being paid. I mean, you think that there'd be so much griping and rumbling about what monies is handed out to anybody in a redress scheme who under all sorts of circumstances has to give testimony and be affected by effectively re-traumatizing themselves and giving that testimony 10s and 20 and 30 times, maybe 100 times over between academics and media, and then these investigative processes. I mean, it's absolutely shocking, John, the way people are constantly treated, and it is ongoing abuse. It's ongoing.
Frank, in terms of the redress scheme, is it like a class action lawsuit, and that they've accepted liability and now they just have to work out what they owe certain people?
Do you know, it's a really interesting question, because earlier today, that's exactly what was going through my mind. And I, in the past, have been involved, not in anything like this, but in group actions for consumers, sort of 300, 500, 700 consumers. And I know that when you're dealing, say, with insurance companies and they admit liability on behalf of their clients, the only thing to do then is effectively sort out a tariff, if you like, for each of the different elements, and to determine who qualifies into which tariff or which band, and if there are additional circumstances that should be applied. But the one thing that I did think about, and I was just really interested in what Eunan was just saying there, is I was asking myself the question earlier today, what if I was the Minister for Children in the Irish Republic? How would I deal with this particular issue? Well, the first question I'd ask is it morally correct that the Irish government, that me, the Minister, the Irish government should deliver unto all the victims and survivors and their families an immediate payment in lieu of further assessment? And the answer in my head was yes, of course. Do I need a consultative body to tell me that that's what I should do? Well, no, because I'm the Minister and I can make that decision. Is this something that I can actually action and get out into the Dáil and actually make that announcement? Well, yes. Would that actually benefit me politically? Of course it would. It's these kind of simple questions that can be answered by people who are paid a great deal of money, let's face it, to make decisions in the public interest. And so therefore, whatever about the use of consultative bodies to aid the minister or governments, and to answer Eunan's question about how much these cost. Well, I can see in the European Union, I don't know what they're charging in the Republic, but in the European Union, they are earning a great deal of money. And so therefore, my final question earlier today was, if I'm the Minister, am I actually using public money to the best advantage? Or could I actually deploy that money within my departments and thereby perhaps even create employment in my department to actually foster the kind of sense that not only A, that I'm in control, but that B, all my constituents, all my fellow Irish citizens can see that I am in control, that I actually am not running behind events, that I'm actually creating the events. And I think this is the big issue. And I'll just round this one off because I really want to bring in Breeda's earlier comments about her experience with Offaly today.
Yes.
It wasn't PR management. That was PR fail. And the reason it failed is because the ship of state is rudderless on this issue. It should be leading, like on my imaginary ministerial role, it should be leading and delivering solutions, immediate solutions in the way they are. They should be leading in terms of policy and saying to councils, here is what you will say, here are the bullet points of our recommendations, and we would like to see those set out. And you will consult with all the victims and survivors in your respective counties. This is not difficult. It's not rocket science. It's not difficult to achieve. It just needs that political courage and will to actually deliver what is really required, not just for the victims and survivors, but for all Irish people, I think.
Yeah, completely. In fact, why does Breeda have to go around to these councils?
Yeah.
I mean, really, in a sense, why are they just going ahead? And as soon as the report came out, they should have.
Yeah. I mean, thank goodness you've got people like Breeda and Eunan who are there advocating, on the ground with these councils. They are the conscience. They are the conscience of Ireland. they are the conscience of the victims and survivors.
Yeah.
And they are pricking the consciences of politicians. And, you know, it is something that really the minister, and I say this with respect to Minister O'Gorman, it really is something that he should reflect upon. And I think he would gain a great deal of insight if he was to just simply join us on this call. If he was to just simply have the three of us on a Zoom call into his office, I think he would probably recognize that there are easier solutions than adopting a cul-de-sac policy.
Yeah. Breeda, finally, just
to say that councillors do not want to hear from grassroots. They take their instruction top down. Not councillors, rather, the council management team, and maybe the Cathaoirleach in this case, because I told Councillor Carroll when I was speaking to him, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We've actually done it with Galway County Council, who have been reaching out, who do support survivors, who have shown their records, who have provided grant aid, lots of support, hands-on support, you know, and
Cork County Council as well, wasn't it, Breeda?
Cork County Council have been good. Mayo County Council have been excellent. They've taken their lead from Galway, and of course they're close to them anyway. But I think holding a special meeting is the way forward. And then councillors who are elected by their constituents will learn, and they may next time round meet somebody who is a survivor, who's not ashamed to say, I survived one of those homes and thank you for what you've done for me. You know.
Brilliant. Yeah. Eunan?
John, if I could just give one example again about what Frank was talking about there about consultation and money's absolutely wasted. Like anybody would be aware of the renewable heat energy scheme that there was in the north a while back, which could actually set up an inquiry overnight when other people spent years and years and years trying to find get an inquiry set up. But at one stage they actually paid 100,000 sterling pounds to a consultancy firm about how they were going to deal with the whole debacle around the RHI, and what they did was completely ignore the advice and the recommendations of that consultancy firm. So an RHI inquiry that basically cost the public over £500 million, with a further £16 million for the actual inquiry itself. That was a complete and utter waste of time. Nobody was indicted or held to account. So this is where we are with governments and the way politics sort of circles the wagons and protects itself to make sure that the institution of itself, the reputation and the structure of it is basically the most important aspect of it. Whereas the people on the ground, and especially, you know, the issues that we're involved in when it comes to institutions, we're basically just roadkill, absolute carnage and cannon fodder, you know, in a big game of politics where political chicanery and all of these sort of moves that go on in the background are just there to completely frustrate people and to break the souls and the spirit of people. This is what the process is all designed for. It's to absolutely kill you spiritually, psychologically. Some would say it's actual. It's psychological and emotional rape. That's exactly what it is, and that's what it purports to do on a regular and a daily basis, unfortunately.
Yeah, and you really do feel that you're dealing with kind of almost on a spiritual level, sort of evil, you know, multi-generational evil, just an accumulation of, from the crimes itself to the cover-up to now the consultants. It's just disgusting, you know. I mean,
well, it is. We're in the wrong game at the end of the day. You know what I mean? They're you know, on COVID and the way, you know, the governments, British government especially, is the way it handled COVID and the way that it's handed out contracts for PPE and all this. You know what I mean? They're just laughing at us basically. You know what I mean? And they can do whatever they want because accountability, I've said, in so many respects, in so many occasions, is a complete myth when it comes to, you know, the reality of the world we live in.
Yeah. Well, we'll leave it there. Frank, hopefully you can join us next week.
Yes, indeed, yeah.
We'll keep an update. Breeda Murphy, Eunan Duffy, Frank Brehany, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, and we'll see you all next week. Thanks.
Indeed.
Thanks, Joe. Night, everyone.